if you've lived in Ohio for any amount of time, you know that we have a pretty detailed history with this species. In Ohio, they've been important throughout our whole history. So they've been around even since the end of the last ice age. So they've been here for a very long time. And they're important to help us survive as a species and later as a culture as time progressed. But they were helpful because of obviously meat, right? We use them for food. Their hides were used for warmth and protection. And then their bones were used as tools as well. It's even been discovered in some burial sites discovered by archaeologists that they were used for rituals and ceremonies, and they've been found in burial sites. Some of you are familiar with the Hopewell Mound, like we have a Hopewell Mound at Towner's Woods, but in some of the excavations in southern Ohio, they found that they had antlers with iron or copper on them that were found to be used by Hopewell shaman in some of their ceremonies. So they've been important culturally for a very long time. You may know that it is our state mammal, and that was adopted in 1988. But we're not the only ones that love white-tailed deer because it's a state animal of 8 other states as well. So not only prehistorically, but they were important during colonization as well. So their pelts were used as a bartering system. So if you wanted to trade things, this was a really hot commodity. And in fact, that's where we get the term bucks from, like the slang term we use for a couple of dollars. Because if you were to trade something, it could be worth a couple of bucks or buckskins, which is where that word comes from. Make sure I'm watching everybody. Okay. If I don't get to your question during the presentation, then I'll go back through those questions at the end and make sure I hit them all. But keep throwing them in there. So there is our scientific name, and they can get pretty big, right? 110 to 300 pounds. And you may know that they're ungulates, right? So that means that they have hooves, but that also means that they have a variety of adaptations that allows them to survive, including those long legs. So those legs are really good for increased running speeds to help them get away from predators because have a lot of other things that are going to help them fight something off. But if you can run fast and get away from it, that's a pretty good deal as well. They also have antlers used for a variety of reasons, and then the specialized teeth that's going to help them eat their specific food sources. They are the smallest deer species in North America, and we do have 5 deer species in North America. So in the chat box, I want you to throw up your guesses. What are the other deer species in North America? Can you take a guess at what any of those are? Good. Yeah, we got most of them. We got all of them. There they are. Thank you. So the 5 that we have in North America are obviously the white-tailed deer, but also the mule deer, the elk, the moose, and the caribou. Obviously, you guys know we don't have moose or elk here, at least not anymore, right? But we have these wonderful creatures, and they're the smallest of all of those. They're pretty skilled though, right? So we said they have those long legs to get away. They can run up to 30 miles per hour, and that's even within a forest, right? So they're very, very agile creatures. Not only can they run up to 30 miles per hour, but they can also jump up to 10 feet in the air. So they're pretty springy as well. They're called white-tailed deer for a reason. I'm sure you can see in that picture that they have that white tail that they'll push up, and it makes them pretty obvious wherever they are, even if they're well camouflaged in their forest. But they also have white patches around their eyes, a little bit on their throat, and then you can see a little bit how the inside of their legs and their bellies also have those white patches on them. But Ohio is pretty dense with deer, right? So ODNR, or the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, estimates that there are about 600,000 in the state, right? That's a lot. And Todd, to answer your question, it was estimated about 91 deer per square mile. So that's our population density that I could find quickest. So per square mile, 91 deer. That seems like, I know, it seems like a lot, right? Exactly. Okay. Um, and the other thing I wanted to share here is that deer are crepuscular, which is probably my favorite biology word, and that just means that they're active during dusk and dawn. I'm sure you've heard of nocturnal animals, which are active at night, and diurnal animals, which are active during the day, but crepuscular carry that dusk to dawn description with them, which is sure when all we see them. So they do have really good hearing and really good vision, but survival, this trait that pays the most, that helps them the most, is their sense of scent. Okay. Wait. Let's move on to their habitat. You and I know, since we are Ohioans, that they can be found anywhere, right? They don't seem to prefer one thing over the other, because I've seen them in all different kinds of habitats. But if they had a choice, they would prefer these open woodlands, right? But they can be found in lots of other places. I know we see them on farmlands, along the brush, but also in dense thickets. And then with sleeping, they'll sleep wherever they want as long as they feel safe. So they can sleep in groups or alone. And then if they're going to sleep during the day, they're going to find a place that's more secure with heavier cover because they would be easier to spot with the sun out. But they'll still take a rest during the day. And then they might use the same bed over and over again as long as they feel safe and secure there. But it's not unrealistic that they would have multiple beds within their range in order to feel secure. Okay. So deer are herbivores. They like plants and they prefer buds and twigs from a variety of trees. And those can be a lot of the ones that we find here. So maple, sassafras, or aspens, poplars, and birch, they love those. But they'll also eat a variety of different shrubs that we can find in Ohio. And as we go through, we'll talk a little bit about how they change and their diets change throughout the seasons as well. Okay, I'll come back to that question, Renee. Okay. Let's talk about deer in the summer. So, if you've seen deer in the summer, they look very svelte and slim. It's because part of the reason is because their coats are relatively short during this time of the year. It's warm, so they're going to shed and carry a thinner coat throughout the season, and it also changes color. It'll be more reddish and brown as time goes by. And this is high time for them to load up on all those nutrients, right? So they're constantly eating, and that's going to allow them to pack on the weight so that they can have a successful rut or mating season and then survive throughout the winter as well. In terms of food, this is a good time for them to eat all of those leafy greens. It's also a really good time to get those aquatic plants that they may not have had access to the rest of the year. And then all the fruits that we know they enjoy. So the apples and the berries are what they're going to munch on now. As we move into fall, late October through late November, males go into rut and courtship is going to begin. So this is high time for mating season, right? So when the females are in heat, the males are going to be chasing after them, and a male can follow a female for 5 to 6 days before she decides that she's ready. When she decides that she's ready to breed, they'll mate multiple times over a course of a few days, and the male will hang around in order to fight off any competitors. But after they're done breeding, the male will leave, and then she'll be on her own to raise the young that come from that mating. Because males are in hot pursuit of the females and they're constantly moving around, fall, specifically October through December, is when us as motorists have to be really alert, right? Because if they're chasing a female, they can easily dart across the road. So that's when we need to be more alert because they're constantly on the move trying to get to one another, right? So we need to pay attention. In Ohio, obviously pay attention the whole time, but it seems even more likely between October and December that you'll have an issue with a deer crossing the road. Fall in Ohio, we know, especially based on today and tomorrow's temperatures, that the climate is funny these days, right? So it may not be as drastic, but the fall in general, they switch their food sources from those leafy greens to things like nuts and acorns. And then since we are in Ohio, crops like corns and soybeans they like as well. Okay, I think if you look at this picture, it'll be pretty obvious that he has a much thicker coat on, right? And you can see that his coat is a little bit more dull than what we've looked at in previous pictures. But they put on this thicker coat so the hairs on top will get longer and more protective, and then they'll develop this thick undercoat that's really good for insulation as well. They will continue to bed, like we talked about before, in places they feel secure, but they'll use their antlers, if it's a male, to kind of brush away the snow, or even use their hooves to brush away the snow from areas where they want to sleep or even their food sources. Eventually, the antlers will fall off of the males and they won't have that tool anymore, but they'll use it while they have it. Because a lot of the trees have lost their cover, you're going to find them bedded down a lot more underneath conifers, but also because of their other food sources not being available, they'll also use conifers or trees that keep their greenery as their food sources. Okay. And then we get back around to spring. I think this one's my favorite picture of those fuzzy antlers, because this is when our males begin to grow their antlers back. Remember, they have to have those antlers in order to fight off the competitors. So spring is when they're going to start. And we see this picture on the left. It might be a little hard to see because of his coloration, but there's a little bump right there, a little outcropping. And that's why young males, usually within the first year, they'll start to grow an antler, but they won't get very far. And that's why we call them button bucks, because they just have these little antlers that are sticking out right there. Male deer will continue to grow bigger and bigger antlers throughout the years until about the year until they're about 6, and then they'll stop growing as much, but they'll continue to grow throughout their life. You might have also heard of the velvet that we see on these new antlers, right? That fuzziness that's on there, it might be a little visible in the picture on the right where it looks softer than a normal antler. So we call that velvet, and that is this protective layer that's full of nerves and a blood supply that allows the antlers to grow big and strong. And eventually they'll calcify and turn hard and they'll lose that velvet, but it just provides the oxygen and nutrients it needs in order to grow. During this time, the females are also preparing to give birth. So starting in late spring, they're going to give birth to their young. And I think one of you had a question about the young. We'll get to that in a second. But after they have their babies, they'll start the whole process again. They'll go through the summer to build up their fat reserves. And then when fall comes again, they'll start to mate. So we've made it through a whole year of a life cycle of the deer. Okay. I think this is my favorite phase of the deer life cycle, are those cute little fawns, right? So we know that in the fall, they'll mate, and then the female will be pregnant all winter, and then start having her babies in May throughout the summer. So gestation is about, on average, 200 days. When the fawn are born, they're on average 6 to 8 pounds, which is super tiny, but they grow quickly, and they'll be weaned within the first 10 to 12 weeks of their life. But by the time the first winter rolls around, they'll also put on about 60 pounds. So they'll grow pretty quickly, right? The males will stay with the mothers that first year, and then leave and go out on their own. But then the females can stay around a little bit longer than the males, right? To answer that question, a doe, her first year, will typically have one fawn, one baby, but after that, it's not uncommon for deers to have multiples, right? So they can have twins or even triplets going forward, right? Let's see. Oh, thanks, Renee. Okay. So, where are we? Okay, signs of the deer. I'm sure if you've ever been on a hike in one of our parks or anywhere in Ohio, you've come across a sign of a deer. Most commonly, it's scat, right? So you can see that picture on the left. Deer scat is in these odd little pellet-shaped piles, right? So you'll find a bunch of them at a time, and they're a little bit more elongated than we see in some other types of scat. Like if you were to compare that to rabbit scat is smaller, it's still in a pile, and it's also more spherical, right? So deer scat is pretty noticeable. You'll also see that they have this very obvious track, right? Because it's an ungulate and it has a hoof, it's a lot different. You're not going to find toe pads like we would in our deers or in our dogs or our cats. So it's this heart-shaped 2 parts with these pointed toes that makes it pretty obvious to go through. So when you're walking the spring, look in the muddy parts of the path and it's, oh goodness gracious, it's very likely that you're going to see a deer track. Okay. I put this up here. I know you're all intelligent people, but I share it with you so that you can share it with other people. Is that sometimes when people come across a young fawn, they might think it's injured or the mother has abandoned it, and more than likely that is not the case, even if it's been there for a long period of time. So does can leave their fawns for hours, and I'm not exaggerating that, right? So sometimes as little as 4 hours, sometimes as close to 12 hours, and that just depends on what phase they're in. So fawns can have 3 phases during the first part of their life. So day 1 to 8, they're in this thing called a bed phase where they'll lay down. And you can see they have these really adorable spots, right? And they'll lay flat on the ground, and that helps them blend in with the forest ground along with that dappled sunlight. So if they lay really flat and really still, it's not likely that something will see them. Okay. But the mother will leave them and come back to check on them periodically. And when a predator comes, they'll lay really flat and really still and sometimes even halt their breathing in order to avoid detection. So that's their bedding phase when they'll just kind of stay there and hunker down. After day 8 to about day 30, they go into this thing called the flash phase. So they'll try to hunker down, but if they feel that they've been spotted, they can get up and run quickly to another spot where they'll bed down again. So they are a little bit more ambulatory and they can move around in order to increase their level of protection. Um, and again, the mother will come back sometimes a little bit more often than during the bedding phase, but she'll come back and check on them. And then, like we just said, they can have twins or triplets. She'll spread them out. So she won't cluster all her babies together. She'll put them in different locations and return to check on them individually in order to increase their chance of survival. And then after day 30, they're in the active phase where they can get up and move around and begin to explore their environment more with their mom and then their siblings if they have them, right? But she doesn't return, the mother doesn't return to them a lot because she doesn't want to draw attention to them. And she won't come if there's humans or a potential threat or a predator to them. So you might think that she's left them for hours, but she might be off somewhere watching you watch her baby and waiting for you to leave so she can return to it. So just leave it and the mother will more than likely come back to it. I think someone had a question about feeding them. So, no, you should not feed deer. It's never advisable to um, feed wildlife, right? Because deer obviously aren't really going to pose a threat to humans directly, right? I haven't really heard of a lot of wild deer bites ever. But if you get them accustomed to humans, right, they lose that ability to be scared of them and they start associating humans with food. So they'll come up, they don't know the difference between you and your mean neighbor, right? So they'll come and get food wherever, even if it's not safe for them. It could also draw them closer to roadways, which might increase car strikes. So it's just best to leave them to how nature intended and allow them to fend for themselves. So, no, we do not advise feeding the wildlife. Just making sure I covered everything. All right. I love this little picture here. Oh, this one came up. So if you're familiar with Mill Creek Metro Park, which is close to Youngstown, this article was from last year, but they had 3 albino deer found in their park system. So if you're familiar with albinism, it's a genetic mutation. So we know melanin is the color or the pigment that gives our color and hair its skin. So this mutation um, causes these animals to not produce melanin. So they are completely white, and you can see a little bit in this picture that their eyes are very light as well. So this causes a variety of issues, right? If you're white in this dark brown or even a green landscape, right, you're going to stand out a lot more to predators. And the fact that there's 3 of them there, because I think this is like a 1 in 30,000 chance of having an albino deer. The fact that there's 3 there indicates that there could potentially be an issue with that herd, right? So maybe there is some inbreeding or some genetic issues that increases the amount of albinos that they're seeing in this population. For right now, they don't think it's too big of an issue because, as you know, we have lots and lots of deer, right? But they're continuing to monitor that. But Youngstown isn't that far from here, so maybe if you head down there to Mill Creek and take a walk around, you might run into an albino deer. Okay. So, these last couple points, I didn't have a slide to put them on. So here's a cute picture of deer and my random facts that I've collected that I wanted to share with you. So we know if you watch your dog, they wag their tail when they're really happy, but that's not the case for white-tailed deer. They only wag their tails when they're startled. So they'll flick up that white tail. You can see really obviously why they're called white tails right here in this image, but they'll flick them up and take off when they're startled or agitated, right? Because they're ungulates, they do have that four-chambered stomach that allows them to chew cud. But because of the four stomachs that can break down food, they are also able to eat mushrooms, and the mushrooms that we're told to stay away from. So they can eat poisonous mushrooms as well. And then with their eyes, we know they have good eyesight and good hearing, but their eyes don't see all the colors that we do. So the reds and greens and the orange, they don't see that as well. That's more along their gray colors, right? So if you think about like hunters, right? Hunters wear orange, they're not going to stand out to the deer. So that makes more sense. Let's see. There, Renee said there's an albino we see in Manaway Township occasionally too. Oh, I didn't know that. I'll take a look out. And Todd also said they stomp their feet, their front feet when they're scared too. Good. So not only do they flick their tail, but they'll also try to look a little tough and stamp their feet as well. Good. So that's a good way to try to scare something away before they flee themselves. And then one of my personal favorites here, the sign on this says hole in the thorn, but this is from the ODNR offices. It's a deer mount that's there. But this was a deer that was found right in the Ravenna Arsenal in the 1940s, and it has a puncture wound in its antler. But it was found that this deer, you know how we say like, oh, it's a 6-point buck or an 8-point buck? This one has 44 confirmed points on its antlers, right? And it's recorded as the third largest in the nation. So if you make it down to the ODNR Division of Wildlife office in Akron, this guy is hanging up there on the wall, so you'll be able to spot him. Good. Renee said, and they snort pretty loudly too. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. What's that mean, Todd? Boone and Crockett score? You're gonna have to explain that one. That one's lost on me. Okay. So I think we summed that up in just under half an hour. Oh, I think that slide answers one of your questions, Rance. So the range is about 500 acres, and it gets even bigger during rut. So I think it can get up to about 800 acres will be their total range. Someone else, I think it was Heather, asked about their life, their range. So males will be 6 and females tend to live 2 years longer, but in captivity they can live up to 14. I think the longest living white-tailed deer was 22 in Georgia, I believe, in the wild. And then one of the things that I come across a lot is how to age deer. Maybe you find a skull in the woods and you want to find out how old it is. That's not a skill that I possess yet, but if you wanted to look this up, it's called A Guide to Age Determination of White-tailed Deer. It's a PDF right on Google. It's from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and it goes through picture by picture of like what a young, like 1-year deer, 2-year deer, 3-year deer, what they all look like. Okay. Boone. Oh, that is how the antlers are scored. Good. So we were just talking about how it's like a 12-point buck, and that one was like a 40-something point buck. Todd said it's a Boone and Crockett score, and that's how they score the antlers. That's good to know. But I hope you have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining me tonight.